Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. What is a limitation of sharing Amazon RDS snapshots using AWS Resource Access Manager? Recipient accounts cannot restore or delete shared snapshots. Limits on the number of snapshots that can be shared. Shared snapshots do not include the database schema information. Shared snapshots have shorter retention periods. A limitation of sharing Amazon RDS snapshots using AWS Resource Access Manager is that recipient accounts cannot restore or delete the shared snapshots directly, as the owner account retains control and management rights over the shared snapshots. What is a limitation of sharing resources using AWS Resource Access Manager? Shared resources inherit the permissions of the recipient account. Shared resources are replicated across all linked accounts. Shared resources cannot be modified by the recipient account. Only certain AWS services support resource sharing. A limitation of sharing resources using AWS Resource Access Manager is that shared resources inherit the permissions of the recipient account, which may affect access control. What is one of the key considerations to keep in mind when sharing AWS IAM policies through AWS Resource Access Manager? Limiting the number of permissions that can be shared across accounts. Automatically granting full administrative access to all shared resources. Encrypting IAM policies to prevent unauthorized access and tampering. Ensuring that policies are compatible and do not conflict with existing permissions. When sharing AWS IAM policies via AWS RAM, it is crucial to ensure that the policies are compatible and do not conflict with existing permissions, ensuring consistent access controls without the risk of unintended access to shared resources. Why would an organization choose to share AWS security groups through AWS Resource Access Manager? To increase network latency for improved performance in distributed environments. To optimize resource costs associated with security group usage. To automate resource tagging for all shared security groups. To enforce consistent network access controls across multiple accounts. Organizations may opt to share AWS security groups via AWS RAM to enforce consistent network access controls across multiple accounts, ensuring uniform security measures and access policies across distributed environments. What is a benefit of sharing AWS Direct Connect virtual interfaces using AWS Resource Access Manager? Increasing network bandwidth for Direct Connect connections. Automating failover mechanisms for Direct Connect virtual interfaces. Centralizing data encryption methods for all Direct Connect connections. Enabling multiple accounts to connect to the same Direct Connect gateway. Sharing AWS Direct Connect virtual interfaces via AWS RAM allows multiple accounts to connect to the same Direct Connect gateway, streamlining network connectivity and enhancing collaboration between accounts. In what scenario would sharing AWS CloudFormation stacks using AWS Resource Access Manager be beneficial? When configuration changes are required for existing resources within one account. When multiple accounts need to deploy the same infrastructure templates. When integrating third-party services that require access to the CloudFormation templates. When provisioning resources that only require temporary access permissions. Sharing AWS CloudFormation stacks via AWS RAM is beneficial when multiple accounts need to deploy the same infrastructure templates, ensuring consistency and reducing the effort required for deploying complex environments. What is a possible use case for sharing AWS CloudFormation stacks using AWS RAM? Load balancing traffic between EC2 instances. Creating custom VPC endpoints for private connectivity. Managing software licenses for EC2 instances. Enabling cross-region deployment of infrastructure stacks. A possible use case for sharing AWS CloudFormation stacks using AWS Resource Access Manager is enabling cross-region deployment of infrastructure stacks, allowing multiple accounts to deploy consistent infrastructure resources across regions. What is the primary purpose of granting resource access using AWS Resource Access Manager? To enable secure access and collaboration on shared resources across accounts. To provide full administrative control to all shared resources within an account. To streamline resource provisioning and deployment processes within an organization. To automate resource deletion after a specified period of inactivity. Granting resource access using AWS RAM enables secure access and collaboration on shared resources across AWS accounts, improving operational efficiency and facilitating cross-account resource utilization. What is the benefit of sharing AWS Transit Gateway attachments using AWS Resource Access Manager? Automatically distribute incoming traffic to multiple EC2 instances. Simplify network connectivity between VPCs in different accounts. Improve latency for DynamoDB requests. Reduce storage costs for EBS volumes. Sharing AWS Transit Gateway attachments using AWS Resource Access Manager can simplify network connectivity between VPCs in different accounts, allowing for easier management of network resources. What is the benefit of sharing Amazon RDS snapshots using AWS Resource Access Manager? Enhanced security for S3 bucket data. Automated scaling of ECS services. Centralized management of database backups. Reduced latency for SNS message delivery. The benefit of sharing Amazon RDS snapshots using AWS Resource Access Manager is centralized management of database backups and snapshots across multiple AWS accounts, allowing for unified access and recovery of database data. What is the advantage of using AWS Resource Access Manager to share Amazon RDS database snapshots across accounts? Automating scheduled snapshot creation for RDS databases. Accelerating database query speeds for RDS snapshots. Improving data compression techniques for shared snapshot backups. Enabling data recovery and backup collaboration on shared database instances. Sharing Amazon RDS database snapshots via AWS RAM facilitates collaboration on backup and recovery processes for shared database instances, enabling secure data recovery and ensuring data availability across accounts. What is the primary advantage of using AWS Resource Access Manager to share Amazon EBS volumes across accounts? Automating snapshot backups for all shared EBS volumes. Facilitating collaboration on shared block storage resources. Accelerating data transfer speeds for EBS snapshots. Improving storage efficiency for idle EBS volumes. Sharing Amazon EBS volumes via AWS RAM enables collaboration on shared block storage resources, allowing multiple accounts to leverage the same volumes for storage while maintaining control over access permissions and data security. What is a limitation of sharing AWS VPC peering connections using AWS RAM? Recipient account must approve the peering connection. Shared peering connections do not support inter-account traffic. Peering connections established via RAM have reduced encryption. Peering connections cannot be shared across account root users. A limitation of sharing AWS VPC peering connections using AWS Resource Access Manager is that the recipient account must approve the peering connection before it can be established, adding an extra step to the sharing process. What is the benefit of using AWS RAM for sharing AWS config rules across accounts? Optimizing CPU utilization on EC2 instances. Increasing data storage capacity for AWS config snapshots. Implementing data replication across different regions. Ensuring consistent compliance checks across accounts. The benefit of using AWS Resource Access Manager for sharing AWS config rules across accounts is ensuring consistent compliance checks are performed across all linked accounts, helping maintain a unified security and compliance posture. What is a benefit of sharing AWS Key Management Service keys using AWS Resource Access Manager? Optimizing memory usage for Lambda functions. Reducing CPU overhead for EC2 instances. Automating RDS database backups. Ensuring consistent encryption across accounts. The benefit of sharing AWS Key Management Service keys using AWS Resource Access Manager is ensuring consistent encryption and access control for encrypted resources shared across multiple accounts, maintaining data security and compliance. What is a possible use case for sharing AWS Key Management Service keys using AWS Resource Access Manager? Encrypting EBS volumes across multiple accounts. Creating EC2 instances in a VPC. Configuring Amazon S3 bucket policies. Deploying Lambda functions in different regions. A possible use case for sharing AWS Key Management Service keys using AWS Resource Access Manager is encrypting EBS volumes across multiple AWS accounts to ensure consistent encryption and access control. What is a use case for AWS Resource Access Manager? Sharing Route 53 resolver rules across accounts. Creating independent security groups for each account. Migrating data between S3 buckets. Automatically scaling EC2 instances based on traffic. A use case for AWS Resource Access Manager is sharing Route 53 resolver rules across accounts to allow multiple accounts to resolve DNS queries within a VPC. What is a use case for sharing AWS License Manager configurations using AWS RAM? Deploying Docker containers on ECS clusters. Managing software licenses for Windows Server instances. Enforcing encryption at rest for EBS volumes. Configuring custom IAM policies for IAM users. A use case for sharing AWS License Manager configurations using AWS Resource Access Manager is managing software licenses for Windows Server instances across multiple accounts to ensure compliance with licensing agreements and usage restrictions. What is a benefit of sharing AWS config rules using AWS Resource Access Manager? Automate cross-region replication for DynamoDB tables. Increase data durability for S3 objects. Enable consistent compliance evaluations across accounts. Optimize query performance for Amazon Redshift clusters. Sharing AWS config rules using AWS Resource Access Manager enables consistent compliance evaluations across accounts, ensuring that all linked accounts adhere to the same configuration rules and standards. What is the potential risk of not properly managing resource shares in AWS Resource Access Manager? Unintended exposure of sensitive data to unauthorized users. Increased network latency and communication issues. Resource contention leading to performance bottlenecks. Incompatibility with AWS Lambda functions due to misconfiguration. Failure to properly manage resource shares in AWS RAM could lead to unintended exposure of sensitive data to unauthorized users, compromising security and potentially violating compliance requirements. What is the benefit of using AWS Resource Access Manager for sharing advanced networking resources like AWS Transit Gateway? Simplified administrative overhead and reduced operational complexity. Increased data transfer speeds and reduced latency during network communication. Enhanced data encryption and security measures for network traffic. Automated resource scaling and load balancing for network traffic. AWS RAM offers simplified resource sharing for advanced networking resources like AWS Transit Gateway, reducing administrative overhead and operational complexity while facilitating seamless collaboration and connectivity across accounts. What is a key advantage of sharing resources with AWS Resource Access Manager? Maintaining resource ownership and control. Easier resource scaling. Reduced data transfer costs. Increased data durability. A key advantage of sharing resources with AWS Resource Access Manager is maintaining ownership and control of the shared resources, allowing the resource owner to manage and update the resources as needed. What is a limitation of sharing AWS Systems Manager parameter store parameters using AWS RAM? Recipient accounts cannot modify the shared parameters. Shared parameters have shorter expiration times. Shared parameters are not encrypted at rest. Limits on the number of parameters that can be shared. A limitation of sharing AWS Systems Manager parameter store parameters using AWS Resource Access Manager is that recipient accounts cannot modify the shared parameters directly, as the owner account retains control and management rights over the shared parameters. What is the benefit of using AWS Resource Access Manager for sharing AWS private link endpoints across accounts? Accelerating network traffic between VPCs in different regions. Enabling simplified monitoring and logging for VPC traffic. Avoiding data exposure by securely accessing services within a VPC. Automatically executing intrusion detection systems for VPC endpoints. By sharing AWS private link endpoints via AWS RAM, you can securely access services within a VPC across accounts, avoiding data exposure while maintaining compliance with access policies and improving data security. What is a potential downside of not regularly reviewing and updating resource shares created via AWS Resource Access Manager? Failure to terminate unused resources leading to resource contention. Decreased network bandwidth for shared resource communication. Increased storage costs due to inactive shared resources. Risk of unauthorized access to outdated resources. Neglecting to regularly review and update resource shares created via AWS RAM may introduce a risk of unauthorized access to outdated resources, compromising security and potentially exposing sensitive data to unauthorized users. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.